This is the Balancing Act by Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. Our guest today is Vicky Hailey, who has a wealth of experience around standards development, as well as having her own consulting practice to help organizations move forward in this whole area around privacy and security and a lot of ethical standards that we're seeing coming down the pipeline as well. Vicky, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Altaz. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Vicky, we hear a lot in the industry today about the need to not only consider speed when we're doing development, especially when we talk about DevOps and the pipelines and the questions that emerge from there, but the need to balance this now with privacy and security and compliance. So when we take a look at this sort of not just development approach, which is automated, but more like a balanced development automation approach that is now emerging. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective about the kind of business value that we can get when we consider balanced development automation?
Sure. I think basically what we end up with is better customer satisfaction, because when you take a balanced approach, you're looking at all of the aspects of the system, the implications, the downstream effects, the upstream effects, and that gives the customer much more confidence. When you take the approach that you're only focusing on the technology, the speed, the throughput, you fail to understand and consider all of the real user needs that come within those. So you get the non-functional requirements of things like availability and reliability. Those can be covered by the speed, but then things like privacy. Do you understand that stakeholder's requirement to the depth that is required to be able to really protect that privacy, or the security of the data? And so that's where the balance is really required, because if you do things too quickly without understanding the implications of the up and downstream feedback loops, you're going to fail to meet all of those customer requirements. So the balance really comes in understanding that technology doesn't provide 100% solutions without context, and those context details have to be understood by understanding what your stakeholder needs are.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that interesting? We've seen in the past teams focusing on bringing dev and ops together, and now we're really looking at more than just dev and ops, but bringing together risk and security and compliance teams all together to try and come up with a balanced approach that helps us achieve what the business is looking for. Rightly, as you said, customer satisfaction, security of data, these kinds of things. Can you, let's go one step deeper. Can you talk a little bit about the business level metrics that might be useful to track balanced development automation? What might be valuable that you think we need to radiate as teams are going through this automation that would be, in fact, helpful and useful to the business?
Again, I think the primary bottom line is customer satisfaction. Everything goes to that: your profit, your metrics in terms of your throughput, your capability, your productivity. Those all end up tied to customer satisfaction. So when you use that as the goal, much like Steve Jobs said, take care of the customer and their needs first, then everything else will follow. Those really are the main metrics. And then from there, you can then break it down. You can look at whether or not you're managing your risks properly, whether or not you're getting the risk information in a timely enough manner, especially in a DevOps situation where you've got to be changing on the fly. So those kinds of metrics all get derived from the context that you're operating under. But other than that, you start to get into other types of metrics, such as the rate of innovation. And that should actually improve and increase given that you're in closer contact and communication with your stakeholders. So each context will derive their own metrics, but ultimately they should be a subset of customer satisfaction, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, the value that we are looking to gain to provide to the business, we then generate metrics accordingly to ensure that we're meeting the value proposition at every step of the way. And so we set up guardrails to ensure that we aren't veering too far off course. And you brought up something really interesting, Vicky. You talked about looking at that end customer and driving backwards. Rather than pushing something to the customer, we look at what's valuable to the customer and then work our way backwards from there. And inevitably, we're going to end up with something that's going to be important to the business because it's important to the customer. And then the metrics that we provide all align with what is important ultimately to that customer. Now, this gets into, when we talk about DevOps and moving quickly, it's all about trying to create this value in the most efficient way possible. And from your experience, are you seeing that the whole DevOps and security and how we're beginning to see the convergence of these two is in fact lending itself to a very lean way of getting this value produced that creates the balance out there for the end customer and for the business?
I see it when they do it properly, when they engage with the customer, when they understand the customer's needs and requirements, then they get it right. But when they take shortcuts, when they assume that they understand what the customer's dynamic and changing needs are, and then just try to push that through, then they don't. That's where they fail to get the productivity numbers, the return numbers, because they really haven't listened to the customer. It still goes back to the art of that. And that art of listening to the customer has to translate into the engineering of those requirements into the products and the services that the customer requires. And it's a delicate balancing act because things are constantly changing far higher and at a far greater rate of velocity than we've ever seen before. And so that's why the balancing act is so critical, because if you don't get it right, then you really can have a significant loss based on that.
Interesting. I've got just one more question for you, Vicky, before our time runs out today. Can you talk a little bit about the role that standards can play in helping to drive business value when it comes to balanced development automation?
Sure. Standards provide the agreed consensus on the best way forward, but it does a lot more than that, because what it does is it tends to push the agenda forward, because it sets a baseline for everybody, the minimum baseline that everybody should be achieving, whether it's a technological baseline or an organizational behavioral baseline. And so that sets the expectations up for customers. And so it's imperative that organizations pay attention to the standards, because what it means is if they're not meeting that standard, then they're already falling behind. And the customer requirements are going to be based on their knowledge of where the industry is going. So standards are a really useful way of making sure that at the minimum, you've got yourself up to date with what the current best practices may be. And if you are an innovator, it tells you what you're improving on and tells you where your competitors are so that you can go beyond.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, Vicky, thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Altaz.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Can't get enough of the balancing act? Make sure to check out our website at www.securitycompass.com and be sure to subscribe to our channel wherever you listen to podcasts for more episodes.